So I will try to speak really quite broadly about this idea of 5 lessons that can be learnt from India in order to have enough time at the end for questions and discussion. I think one of the difficulties in speaking or writing about India today is that it has changed so much as a country in the last 15 or 20 years. Suddenly, the effect of a 7, 8, 9% annual growth rate has transformed large sections of the country, even while around 1/4 of the population has been left behind. And the effect of that is that you can have different centuries coexisting, even more than was the case in the past. And it is very shocking to go out of somewhere like the Infosys headquarters in Bangalore and walk only maybe half a mile and find people living in a state of degradation, having just come into the city from the countryside. And my feeling, and one of the things I've written about in the book, India, A Portrait, is the idea that outside views of India have got stuck and need to be developed rapidly. In Britain, very often the Raj view, the imperial view, still comes forward, even when people are trying to move on from it. So, for example, soon after David Cameron was elected as Prime Minister, he took a high-powered delegation of ministers, business people to India, and it was overall a very successful trip. But at the end of a quite interesting television interview, there was a throwaway question by the interviewer, who said, "Oh, and what about the Kohinoor diamond? Are you going to give it back to India?" And he said, "Oh no, we'll keep it in Britain." And the main story on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, its paper the next day, was "Hands off the jewel in our crown." And that kind of thing, which in Britain is familiar or typical, I think goes down extremely badly, not only in India, but more generally around the world. And the kind of reverse view of India, which again has become increasingly popular, is the one popularized by Thomas Friedman and somebody like the businessman Nandan Nilekani. The idea of the world being flat, the idea that the transformation which has hit places like Bangalore or Chennai or Hyderabad or parts of Delhi and Mumbai can be extended right across the country, and suddenly you have a nation of potentially 1.2 billion consumers. And then, of course, as well, you have the traditional post-colonial view, the way that you can only look at India in terms of poverty and suffering. And because inequality has grown, the benefits of economic growth should almost be discounted, and instead you should perhaps return to some statist system of the kind that was in evidence from 1947 up until about 1991. And so what I'm hoping to do really is to kind of draw people out of that comfort zone and say, well, there are other ways of looking at India. And what I've attempted to do in the book is to say, not this is how India should be or might be or ought to be, but simply to say this is how India is at the moment. And so the people I spoke to range from the ones who'd been hugely successful, people like Sunil Mittal, who runs Airtel, a company worth about $8 billion US, and who 25 years ago was importing generator sets from East Asia until his license was taken away by the government. And yet at the opposite end of the scale, it seems to me that somebody like Venkatesh, a man who spent nearly 2 years of his life as a slave in a stone quarry in Mysore, shackled by his ankles. The conversation or the interview that I had with him seemed to me to be as much part of the story of India as the story of Sunil Mittal. So rapid fire, the 5 lessons that I would like to suggest for debate. The first is the idea of managing and dealing with diversity. India is very unusual in that it has been ethnically, linguistically, religiously diverse for well, let's say at least a few thousand years. It will be normal in almost any office in any part of the country to have people who speak a different first language. So, say, for example, you're in Delhi, there'll be people who speak Hindi or English or Tamil or Bengali or Kannada or a range of other languages as their first language. They will eat different food, follow different cultural practices, follow different religious traditions. And although, of course, you can look at moments like the massacres of partition and say, well, there's constant interreligious strife in India, I think given that you have 1/6 of humanity living in a comparatively small country, that overall the relationships between communities are normally fairly good. And the opening image here is simply of people from different religions celebrating Holi, which is essentially a Hindu festival. But one thing that interested me was the way that in the Indian media and in public discourse, more liberal voices from any religious tradition tend to get a lot more airplay than they do here. So if you think in Britain, a country with a Muslim population of less than 2 million people, more global jihadis have been produced by British society than by India, which has around 140 million Muslims. And it seems that very often anybody who pops up and says, I am a representative of my community and I have the following extreme views, is taken perhaps much more seriously than they should be. Whereas somebody like Maulana Madani, the man on the left, who is one of the leading figures in the Darul Uloom Deoband in Uttar Pradesh, he was somebody who I spoke to in a lot of detail, and he essentially has a highly progressive view of the role of Islam both in India and globally. And he got together a total of 6,000 Muslim organizations in India. Again, you're getting the sense of the scale. And they collectively put out a fatwa against the idea of suicide bombings for any reason. And the fact that he could do that and he could comparatively quickly get that level of support seemed to me a remarkably Indian way of going about things. So a second lesson would be the idea of flexibility. Now, sometimes Indian flexibility can be quite hard to deal with, particularly as an outsider if you're trying to do business in India. It can seem more like difficulty and unreliability. But the idea of being extremely flexible, probably in the 21st century, is more necessary than it would have been in the past. And that can be in a small way. For example, the idea of 5,000 dabbawallas, the people in Mumbai who distribute lunchboxes every day. They managed to move a huge number of meals around the city using only hand carts and local trains. It's the kind of thing that you can't quite believe it's happening until you see it. This huge number of people working in a team incredibly fast and incredibly efficiently. And there have been, various business schools who've tried to study the lessons of the dabbawallas. Why is it that they managed to do this? I have a different theory, which is that it's actually a social model rather than a business model, but I won't go into that now. But it seems to me that the idea of flexibility is central to the way in which India works. And so, again, if you think of the concept of democracy as it was thought up by political philosophers, and the way it's put into practice in India, where in order to come to power at the center in New Delhi, you're having to manage a coalition of perhaps 15 or 17 or 19 different political parties. It involves a different way of working, an extremely flexible way of working. So this, for example, is Mayawati, the chief minister of UP, somebody from a Dalit or formerly untouchable background who now is the ruler of about 120 million people. She's being garlanded with banknotes there. She's somebody, a quite typical example of this ability of new parties to pop up out of nowhere. Her party, the BSP, simply didn't even exist until just over 20 years ago. And again, this is perhaps a slightly extreme example of flexibility. But what you're looking at here is a character or a deity called Dalit Goddess English. And she was invented by somebody called Chandrabahan Prasad, who said, well, we've been oppressed for hundreds or thousands of years in our community, so how about learning English as a way of having access to jobs which potentially are going to make us more prosperous? And in order to bring people into this idea, he built a temple, made the deity, created the mantra ABCD, and encouraged people to send their children at a young age, people from poor backgrounds, from Dalit backgrounds, to learn English. And this was all done through the invention of the goddess. And so the idea of flexibility or versatility extends even into religion. The third idea is the idea of learning or education. Now, what I'm suggesting here is not necessarily a good idea. It's not something that I necessarily feel should be emulated, but it's something that perhaps in Britain we should take note of, which is the extraordinary devotion to education and to academic attainment. And just to give you one example of that, this was a young guy, aged I guess about 20, called Pratik Sabharwal. And he managed to top 92% in his board exams and get a place at IIT Delhi. And bear in mind that the Indian Institutes of Technology, the different ones across the nation, have around 8,000 vacancies every academic year. And there are normally about 250,000 applicants. And for somebody like him, who'd come from a comparatively poor background, his father was a wholesaler of edible oils in a Delhi market, he knew that unless he won this place, he was stuck. So I asked him about how he went about it. He said that while studying for his exams, he went to a coaching or tuition class every Saturday and every Sunday. On a weekday, he had come home from school in the middle of the afternoon, and he'd have a rest until about 7 p.m. Then he'd work through till 3 a.m. before getting up again at 7 a.m. I planned it very carefully, he told me, and I believe in retrospect that if I had cut even 20 minutes off my working time each day, I might not have made the cut. So it's a kind of slightly unnerving idea. I don't know, many of you will have children who you're trying to persuade to do their homework or to revise for exams, and it's not always an easy process, particularly when they say to you, but my friend only does half an hour, so why should I do 1 hour of extra work before taking my GCSEs or A-levels? And again, this partly has a religious sanction, the idea of Vidya Mata, or the idea of Saraswati, who you can see here, the idea of learning actually being something more than a pastime, the idea that learning is also a social duty. And just to make it seem that every lesson from India is not necessarily a good one, here's a number 4, a bad lesson from India, which is the environment. And I'm sure that most people here, if they've been to India, will have been shocked by the level of kind of public mess. Certain places where you go and there's plastic or there's a river that's been polluted. You only have to look at parts of the Ganges River or the Kaveri River, and it can be a really sad and depressing sight to see these, amazing, beautiful, great, great rivers of the world being effectively destroyed. And there are many other aspects to this, of course. There's deforestation, which is a major problem in the Himalayas. Although I'm actually going to, at the very end, show you something which slightly contradicts what I'm saying, because there's a reforestation program which is working quite well at the moment. There's the fact that you have places like the mountains famously in Orissa, which are being coveted by Vedanta. You have the fact that if you go to somewhere like Ahmedabad, the level of air pollution is so bad that even when you're sitting indoors, you're still choking. Again, in some cities, that's getting a whole lot better. Delhi, the air pollution has largely disappeared. Again, that was somewhere that used to be highly polluted. So there's also here this horrific sight of leopards that have been slaughtered. This is actually on the Nepalese border, but the virtual extinction of the Indian tiger is extremely depressing. And there you can just see an aerial picture of western India, close to the border with Pakistan, the level of air pollution, most of that coming from either factories or cooking fires. So I guess what this is really about is the limits of growth, the kind of imponderable question of what happens as people in Asia suddenly become so much richer and demand equivalent levels of consumption to those you have in Western Europe or the United States. There's no simple answer to this, but it's a problem which, in most respects, in India, I think, is getting worse. And a lot of the environmental degradation passes almost unnoticed in the absence of a serious central environmental policy. Now, the final lesson from India is the idea of contradictions. Now, as soon as you go to India, immediately you're noticing contradictions and you're trying to deal with them. And if you ask anybody Indian about it, they'll normally say, well, we are like this only, or they'll say, oh, well, this happens only in India. And the idea is that you, as an outsider, are obliged to get used to it. And so that particular street sign is hard to imagine in most other countries, but in India is not a surprising thing to see. And in a way, the idea of contradictions is linked to the virtues of versatility and flexibility. But just to mention one or two of them, there's the fact that you have people like Venkatesh chained up in the quarry. You have around 300 million people living still in extreme poverty, and yet you have 4 out of the 8 richest people in the world coming from India. And of course, the most wealthy person in Britain is of Indian origin. So you have that all going on at the same time. You have this highly dynamic middle class at the same time as a static rural culture continuing. You have a deeply entrenched and very efficient form of democracy, and yet at the same time you have nepotism in politics getting worse than ever. In one of the chapters of the book called Family Politics, I did a survey of every Lok Sabha MP. How did they get into Parliament? And it was deeply shocking that the younger you got, the more likely you were to be hereditary. And in fact, there's a graph in the book going from MPs over the age of 80 to MPs under the age of 30. And you've got 0% are hereditary if they're over 80, to 100% are hereditary if they're under 30. And in some parties, like the Congress Party, it's a whole lot worse. In the Congress Party, 9 out of 10 MPs under the age of 40 are there purely because their mother or father was previously a prominent politician. And again, you have the subject of education. As soon as you talk about the idea of ability and achievement and the brilliance of IIT graduates, you have the fact that a kind of mass education policy has never been effectively implemented in India. One of the great disappointments of Jawaharlal Nehru as Prime Minister, this great Prime Minister, was the fact that basic education, primary education, was never made a priority during his premiership in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. And then, of course, the fact that you have communism and capitalism coexisting even in the same state. You might have a state government in West Bengal, for example, which is communist nominally, and yet it appears to, in many ways, facilitate a form of active capitalism. And so just to close, I would say that many of the things I've mentioned today and that you can see in India today have their roots not only in what's normally called globalization, but also in things that are deeply embedded in Indian society. I don't think that Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, when he became Finance Minister in the early 90s, would ever have thought that the takeoff would be quite so rapid. But it was almost as if there was a whole group or community of people with a very strong, embedded entrepreneurial spirit who were ready to go. And when those opportunities came up, things moved remarkably quickly. And that has its roots in all sorts of things, cultural and religious practices, things connected to Hinduism and the idea of learning and attainment. But it also probably has its roots in some of the central planning done by the founders of independent India, the creation of very good institutes of learning, like the IITs or the IIMs, the creation of a fledgling space program, the importing of very early computers made by the Soviets and made by IBM in its early days in the 1950s. So a lot of the things that you see coming to fruition now have their roots in that earlier period. And of course, in a wider sense, the political or social attainment of people like Mayawati, or the new kind of politicians that now control large parts of the country, have their roots in the universal franchise, which was granted immediately after independence, so that people who previously for generations could have gone nowhere now have a quite exceptional kind of social mobility. And even if that doesn't extend to everybody yet, the possibility or the theory is there. And just in case you're wondering who this is the head of India's space program today. And what he is illustrating to you is the fact that in India, because of the nature of Hindu thought, there is no split between science and religion. There's nothing in Hinduism to say to you that if a certain scientific discovery is made, your religion will be undermined. And I think that very much links back to the earlier, or the first point, the idea of flexibility and versatility. So thank you very much.
Do you want to...
Yeah, I'll come back.
I'd like to move on to questions pretty quickly because we have about half an hour. There's one thing I would like to ask Patrick, if I may, at a personal level, which is how do you feel when you travel around India? At the moment, one of my favorite books is being dramatized on Radio 4. I don't know if any of you've heard The Far Pavilions. It's such a beautiful book, and this character of this boy called Ashok, who grows up thinking he's Indian, but really he's Ashton, as we find out later. In England, when if you're an Indian growing up, if you become too English, they say, oh, he's a coconut, you know, brown on the outside, and this is the opposite. So do you sympathize with the character? I mean, how do you feel as you travel around India?
No, because you see, my feeling when you said that thing initially, the idea of becoming Indian, I don't think any outsider can ever become Indian. Sonia Gandhi may be an exception. She does seem to have been assimilated in a very unusual way. But I think that because Indian identity is so strong and so specific that you don't become part of it. So even if you spend a lot of time there or you marry into an Indian family, there's always that sense of being an outsider. It's not like the United States where, you know, I've noticed Indians in the United States, they seem to become American remarkably quickly. There was in fact one man who I met on an aeroplane, who I very briefly mentioned in the book, and he had done well in college in the 1960s in India, but he'd gone to America to seek his fortune. And he ended up joining the US Army. And he was in fact the first Indian US Army officer. And he said that he gave up his Indian accent in 1 week and adopted an American accent. And the reason for that was because he was on his way to Vietnam. In fact, he never went, but he was about to go. And he was calling out bombing targets over the radio. And as he was calling them out, a kind of senior officer grabbed him by the collar and said, "You're going to get somebody killed because we can't understand what you're saying." But that process of assimilation, which in America is famously straightforward because it's an immigrant society, I don't think applies in India.
Maybe, but there are some Englishmen in India. We don't think of them as English. And Mark Tully is Mark. And I think you are now getting to the point where you are not an English author who's written about India, but we just think of you as Patrick.
Well, in fact, there was an interviewer in Chennai who said, "You're not writing like you're not writing like a foreign author. You're writing like an elite Indian author." And so I said to her, "Do you mean that as a compliment or as an insult?" And she said, "Oh no, that's a compliment."
Yes. I think you're getting to the stage where you are family. You picked on something which I think it's important that when Cameron became, you referred to Cameron, when he became opposition leader, first trip was to Bombay, and he spoke of a new special relationship, and he followed it up with the trip in July last year. Do you think that there can be a new special relationship, and can that be used in some way to help economic development in Britain going
well,
through a hard time?
I think Britain has to try. I think the British government has to try. I mean, the difficulty is the fact that increasingly people in India, if they're looking abroad, they're either looking to East Asia or they're looking to the United States. And it's not that the British connection has disappeared, but it's increasingly difficult for Britain to have the central position that it would once have had. And I don't know if there's an answer to that. It's really part of this very, this huge shift of global economic and therefore political power to Asia. And you have a situation really where the world is now returning to the way it was for many centuries. It's only the last 300 years that the West has been, the dominant economic power. And that shift is hard to manage. I don't know exactly how any Western government can manage it, but I guess you have to try to be part of that process.
When you go around India, do you find that people are friendly to you? Is there any colonial baggage still? Or
I used to find that colonial baggage there. It used to come up, but now it just kind of doesn't. Obviously, occasionally it might, but it's not part of the interaction in the same way. And I think probably that comes partly out of Indian national self-confidence being much greater than before. And so, for example, in Bollywood films now, the Britisher is no longer automatically a villain. Quite often they might be, but it's not an automatic thing. Whereas if you go back to the films of the 60s and 70s, you pretty much knew that the Britisher was going to give some horrible order, and then somebody was going to creep up behind him and bang him on the head with a stick. And it was just part of the way in which the former colonial power was portrayed.